And joining us now to help close out this session is Elisabeth Reynolds, the Executive Director of the Task Force on the Work of the Future at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm eager to hear how Elisabeth views the impact of this pandemic on innovation, competitiveness, and the economy. Elisabeth, great to see you. Look, I was reading, old magazines. We're all doing different stuff during the pandemic, and I came up with an issue of Wired magazine from January 2000, so more than 20 years ago, and it was Bill Joy who wrote, and with the cover of it was a very dystopian take on technology, and it was called Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. So now we're almost 21 years later. We're still in it, but I guess if it were written today, I would ask you the same thing. Does the future need us?
Well, interesting way to start this, Steve. And I would say that when MIT set up this task force and we called it the work of the future, as opposed to the future of work, we weren't trying to be, clever. What we were trying to do is assert that the issue going forward was not work, whether there would be work, but in fact, the quality of that work, the accessibility of that work. And of course, the pandemic has thrown that in a curveball on that front. But just a year ago, our concerns were really about quality and not so much about quantity. We've had a shortage of workers up until this pandemic, and demographic-wise, the one thing we can be certain about is what we see going forward. We're still, when we get to the other side of this, we still have, a retiring workforce and aging population and all of those things. So we're still in the game, and we will still be in the game. We have the issue really is going to be how we support the most vulnerable workers in society. And really, COVID has exposed the weaknesses of our system and exacerbated a bunch of the trends that we have seen as part of the task force work. The first, and this is a number of your speakers already have alluded to this, but what does remote work really do? What is the kind of the primary effects and the secondary effects? Well, primary effect is that about 40% of workers can work from home. We are largely from a higher educated quartile, and we are probably going to continue to work from home on some level. Right now, we're thinking everybody from about at least 1 to 3 days, probably post-pandemic, will be working from home. And so what's the knock-on effect of that? Well, the knock-on effect is that this telepresence, which my colleague David Mindell refers to all of this as, is sort of a form of automation itself. So all of those workers who used to support all of us commuting into the office, the business travel, et cetera. So whether it's restaurants, bars, cleaning, maintenance, retail, hospitality broadly, we're seeing those jobs just get wiped out in the short term, and unfortunately we're seeing more long-term effects right now. So those low-wage workers who have been vulnerable over time, in our society, who haven't gained necessarily in sort of the gains we've seen, are now hit hard by the pandemic and by our remote work, which we can imagine will continue to some extent. And then the double whammy on that one is also that a lot of these jobs, and where we've had a lot of growth, is in cities. And we expect that there'll be some level of de-densification. I don't think it's as dire as some people are projecting, but again, there will be perhaps less people commuting into cities, where we find a lot of the personal services and service jobs that have been supporting low-wage work, and where you have found growth historically for the lower-skilled workers.
Elisabeth, I love how you framed it as work of the future, and you've hit so many different topics that I care about, ageism, vulnerable communities that aren't connected. I mean, you've just packed in, my agenda. We could talk for hours, which we can't do today, but I hope you'll come back when we do it. But one of the things one of my questions out there, I mean, you're at one of the world's greatest research and educational institutions. But I'm wondering whether or not the way in which we've organized education and training in this country is at the point where it should be. It seems to me it needs to be more nimble. It seems to me we talk about lifelong education, but we don't do it. When I look at, an aging workforce, I look at that as talent being left on the table. Why can't we find ways to make sure that talent isn't exiting the workforce, that we're kind of, keeping it in to the degree that we can in smart and kind of dignified, ways. Are you thinking about the educational ecosystem and training ecosystem around work of the future?
We are, very much so, and it comes in many dimensions. And you're right. I think that if anything, this crisis has exposed to us where we need more flexibility and more nimbleness in the system. I mean, we think about the dramatic changes that are happening to educational institutions, as well as all the innovation going on for online learning. Our challenge has been and will continue to be the access to that education, and whether we can kind of increase that access and also make it more affordable. So our research is very much focused particularly on those we think are most vulnerable to technological change, and right now, of course, to this pandemic. But those are those from high school to sort of under a 4-year degree. How are we helping those students and those people find a path forward? Because as you alluded to earlier, we need multiple pathways now. We need to be really creative about this. We do not a 4-year degree, while it's had high returns for people, is not the pathway forward for everyone. And so we've seen a lot of creativity, I think, in finding ways to get people from high school into more education. We know people need more education after high school, but what can that look like? Is that the 2-year college, community college degree? And companies like IBM, for example, have set up something called Pathways to Technology, programs where we get people from seniors in high school all the way through to become cyber security technicians. You don't need a 4-year degree in computer science to necessarily be a technician. So let's find those pathways. And I think also a lot of new kind of certifications emerging. And I think, as one of your previous speakers said, the issue there is we want to make sure that those have been vetted and that they have good returns for people if they invest in them.
Elisabeth, years ago, I had the opportunity to interview a Nobel laureate named Arno Penzias, and he said something, he'd already said something kind of offensive, so I apologize, folks, but this was around the onset of the internet, and he said, the internet is going to make smart people smarter and dumb people dumber. Do we now, given what we see in broadband with the coming world of AI, 5G, Internet of Things, quantum computing, and all of that which will be part of the environment in which we're working, have we dulled down Penzias's diagnosis of this? That have we begun to look at the gaps and the great distance between folks? Because I was somewhat offended, but there's a certain truth in what he shared then too. And I'd be interested to see if you think we're much smarter about anticipating those gaps than we are today, back then.
Yeah. Well, I might phrase it a little differently, which is to say that technology can be both a substitute for human activities or a complement to human activities. And what we know is that a lot of this technology is a complement for those who are higher educated, right? So if you're, a lot of this AI is driving greater insight for lawyers or something like that, or helping, with our doctors and radiologists in certain ways. And so that is a complement. The downside is some of this technology can be a substitute for tasks that the lower skilled workers are doing, right? You think about retail and the self-checkout kiosk right now, and that's an automation that's now getting rid of and eliminating certain jobs in retail that used to be there and would be there for low skilled workers. So it is, I think the thing is that the technology is a tool, and how we use it is, dependent upon the different tasks that are involved. What we'd like to see and what we were trying to encourage in our research is to talk about not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. How can we use technology so that it actually is a tool and a complement for everyone? Now, there's some jobs that are just, we know some, warehousing jobs. We have more warehousing jobs, by the way, than we've had in a very long time because of e-commerce. Some of those jobs will go away. I mean, we've got robotics that are going to get better and better at it. But the challenge for all of us is let's get the technology into people's hands and find a way to make it a complement to their skill set. And that's, I think actually that's a deterministic, that the quote earlier is very techno-deterministic. And in fact, we can actually have a lot to say about how we shape this going forward.
Well, Elisabeth, you've really helped us stretch out this conversation in great new directions. And I'm going to correct something. I often tweet about future of work. I'm now going to tweet out, hashtag future work. I'm going to do hashtag work of the future. I think it's a much better frame. So Elisabeth Reynolds, Executive Director of the Task Force on the Work of the Future at MIT. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll come back. This is a very rich topic and important one. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. It's been great.